I've got to ask a question because you have a global mindset as pertains to business. Here in the States, you go to any convenience store and just about every product you see has on the back made in China. And there's no secret that China is a superpower when it comes to economics, making many of the products that definitely we here in the States purchase and exchange. How did this happen? What, from your vantage point, how did China become? What strategic steps did they do from your vantage point that positioned them in this place?
There's a few things about China which people don't understand. So what we are seeing is not the rise of China, it's the re-rise of China. Many people forget that the United States was birthed in 1776, was the Gettysburg Address. So, and China is a couple of thousand years old. The Great Wall of China alone is 5,000 years old. So if you compare the US to China, you guys are kind of a teenager, right? China was the world's largest superpower in the 16th, 17th, and 18th, and parts of the 18th century, right? The rise really of economic power in the West came in a lot of parts of the 19th and most importantly, the 20th century. And they were birthed in part by the steam engine and several other things which created the first industrial revolution and then the second, et cetera, et cetera. The literature is there and anybody can go and read it. But pre the industrial revolutions, China was the big boy in the global economic neighborhood. That's who China was. But what happened with China, and by the way, I spent some time with the Deputy Reserve Bank governor of one of the poorest countries in Africa, and I was saying exactly this to her. I was saying to her, you need to learn from what China did. Because what happened with China is they went through a period of communism, which reduced wage rates. Now, what communism does is communism says, regardless of your level of skill or specialization, you and I earn the same. So a doctor, a teacher, and a street sweeper earn the same salary. Now, as human beings, we're driven by reward and risk. So if there is no reward based on taking a particular risk, I don't take the risk. In other words, if there is no reward for me to specialize because I'm not going to earn more, then I'm not going to specialize. And so what happened with China was because they reduced the wage rate and averaged it out across the citizenry, regardless of the level of specialization, there was a collective a collective dumbing down is the word I'm looking for of the population. And people increasingly became less productive in the economy because there was no incentive to produce more, because even if you produced more, you earned the same, right? And so that reduced the wage rates in China, and China became one of the poorest countries in the world. There were rampant levels of poverty. It went back into in development, it became agrarian, it became rural again. And then what happened was something that's very interesting. China realized that if you're poor, that means your cost per unit of labor is cheap. Because you're poor, people who live in your country will accept lower wages. And so what China did is it industrialized some of its geographies. And around that industrialization, it began to employ Chinese citizens on low wages. And firms, capitalists by nature, look for the lowest input cost. So if there's a part of the world that you can outsource your production to because they can do it for cheaper, you will. And that's why you saw many firms around the world, many great US firms, begin to ship their production from the US to China because they could get it done for cheaper. All China did was she took advantage of her disadvantage. She recognized that she was poor, that she could earn lower wages, and then as a consequence of that, she attracted global. It's happening now with Vietnam. It's kind of really the same thing. It's the attraction of global production because the cost of production in those centers is so low. That's what China has done. But that was the first step. The second thing China did was she then went, well, now that we've got the global production here, we now need to get global development to happen here. So then they started learning the things that the rest of the world was making. Not just making them, but learning how to make them. And then they started producing their own carbon copies of those very same things, right? Which is why there were people talking about fake goods coming from China looking like real goods. That's exactly where it come from. They were producing carbon copies, proving that they can do the same thing, but cheaper. And now what we're seeing is sometimes they're doing even better than many developed countries, and they're doing it cheaper. What they did was very deliberate. It was a state-sanctioned program, and they had a low cost of input, and they made sure that they leapfrogged the rest of the world.
You said something so poignant there. You said they took advantage of their disadvantage. I'm wondering, how can what can we pull out of this lesson when you think about China? How can we learn from their footprints in the earth?
So I think, probably the single most important the most important lesson is to acknowledge your weaknesses, right? Yeah. Because you can't address what you don't accept. So you have to acknowledge your weaknesses. And once you've acknowledged your weaknesses, you then understand what are the complementary set of skills that you need to make up for those weaknesses, right? I'll tell you about myself. I'm a phenomenal visionary, great strategist. I'm great at exciting people and bringing them towards a vision. I hate administration. I hate administration with a passion. If I see a piece of paper in my table, I get a headache, right? Don't send me a 200-page report on something. My brain starts buzzing, right? So what I've learned is I've surrounded myself with people who will read a 300-page report, word for word, and who will give me the detail, the nuance that I need. Now, it doesn't mean I can't. I can. Of course I can. I spent, a decade of my life in corporate finance. I'm very good at reading those things. I just don't like doing it. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge your weaknesses. The second thing to do is to surround yourself with the skills that make up for those weaknesses. The third thing to do is probably the one that people spend the least amount of time on. Play to and amplify your strengths. If you don't play to and amplify your strengths, you're never going to win. And so a lot of us spend so much time trying to make up for our weaknesses, we don't realize where we're strong. It's a bit like going to school and taking 6 subjects. You get 6 A's and you get 1 D, and you start worrying about improving the D to a C, and you ignore the A's that you got. What you got to do is you got to figure out, how do I make these A's A+, right? Yeah. Forget the D. And so that's kind of what the mindset, if you're great, and that's why you'll find typically great businesses have co-founders, and typically great entrepreneurs have a strong support system.